And hello, everybody, and welcome to Presence. I am Doug King. Thanks for joining us in this continuing discussion of the Holomovement as related to the biblical narrative. And why are we doing this? Again, I want to continue to emphasize the why behind this. We are taking a cross-disciplinary approach to the biblical narrative. Why do that? Because for 2,000 years, it's been a closed system, a closed religious system. And when it's closed, whoever interprets something, if you don't agree with it, they just denominate. And there's nothing that you can really do other than to say, my view makes more sense than your view. What about a cross-disciplinary approach? Well, in a cross-disciplinary approach, we take models that we know from history and science and other fields of study, and we apply them to our interpretation of the biblical narrative. And then we say, now let's look at other interpretations of the biblical narrative and see if they align themselves with these accepted models. One of the models I've used for years is spiral dynamics. And I've gotten amazingly good feedback because people are seeing that as a historical model that has nothing to do with religion, it aligns beautifully with the way the biblical narrative tells the story. It also explains why we have the denominations that we have today. And I've gone into that at great depth, and you can find that on our website. Now we're using the Holomovement, which comes from science. And so we're saying, from a scientific standpoint, quantum physics has a concept that has to do with two orders that are held together by a movement called the Holomovement. Holo meaning whole, WHOLE. So let's get to it. Let me see if I can do a share screen here. Let's see if we can get right to our chart. There it comes. I'm sorry for the delay. All right. Here's where our chart started. It's the story told from a cosmological point of view. Cosmology is what? Well, it's our universe, it's the cosmos. So that's the first story told by God. And what does science have to say about that? Science has shown through quantum physics that there is an absolute explicate order that we've known about for many centuries. And it's called an explicate order because our universe is made of forms or things. However, with quantum physics, experimentation has proven, it is now an accepted fact, that there is something that transcends our universe of time and space that is an order behind and beyond time and space, which operates in our universe, which is an explicate order. And that is called an implicate order. The implicate order is the source, not the explicate order. First, there has always been this implicate order. And I say always because it's beyond time. Therefore, it has no beginning and it has no end. You have to have time for that. And so it's the source of the explicate order. And the same then is true in biblical cosmology. So the Holomovement, I should say this before I move to biblical, the Holomovement is that which shows the movement from the implicate order to the explicate order. We've talked about that movement. Now, what we're saying is the Holomovement is to universal cosmology, the cosmology of our universe, what Christology is to biblical cosmology. God's telling both stories. One story is told through the creation that we can study with telescopes and microscopes and so forth. The other is a story that's been told through time and history by various players in that story. And so we have in both law that operates only in the explicate order of our universe. In the implicate order, there are no forms or things of our universe. The implicate order of our universe transcends that. There are no laws. There is no law of relativity. The implicate order transcends the law of relativity, thermodynamics, and gravity, speed of light. Those things are transcended. There is no law in the implicate order. What is the implicate order? It's identity. So there is no law with regard to the identity of our universe. And in biblical cosmology, we're saying that there is no law, as in Moses and the law, with regard to universal human identity. And that Christology is not an identity. It is role and function. Its role and function is transform. I'll go back to Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians, where he said God was in Christ reconciling the world to God. It was a God to God process. And so God was in Christ. That's the God action. It was Christological. And so what was that action? It was a movement. It was an action. What action? It was the action of deliverance. It was the action of mercy. It was the action of reconciling, restoring. It was the action of raising first Jesus from the dead, and then eventually all the dead. How did these God actions take place? Well, in both the individual, Christological individual Jesus, and in the second person, Christological body or collective, the process was one of crucifixion, which was dying to the self and rising by the power of God. Resurrection is by the power of God. Jesus was raised by the power of the Spirit of God, Romans 1, into another cosmos called a new cosmos, a new creation, a new heaven and earth. So this is the process. And we have been talking about law. Now, to say that law has a role and function is not to say that when our identity is purely determined by the world in which we live or the covenant under which God now has put this new heaven and earth, which we'll look at in detail, that means that law doesn't exist. No, it means that the law has been fulfilled, which is what Jesus said he came to do. What do I mean the law was fulfilled? What I mean is it was appropriated in its proper role and function. What is its role and function? Its role and function is in our explicate world of human beings related to each other, in our social context, our human doing context. And when I say human doing, it means we use law to govern the doing of people. You can't murder, or you can't drive 60 miles an hour through a school zone. This is the use of law. But Christianity, for 2 millennia, since its beginning, and since its initial interpretation by the Roman Empire, using that level of consciousness available to them, law has been used to determine identity. It has not been used as role and function. And this is why Paul seems to be confusing. He's saying the law is good. The law is good, Paul learns, when it is properly appropriated to the realm of doing, which is not the realm that provides our God identity. When you attempt to use the law for establishing your God identity, then Paul says, here's what happens. The law kills, it brings death. And that seems to be Paul absolutely contradicting what he said when he wrote to the Romans. But he's not, you have to understand the context of Paul. So, what are some of the elements? Bondage. What does bondage belong to? It belongs to the explicate order. What do we find in the explicate order? Sin and death. Where does sin and death come from? It requires law. In other words, we will talk at some point here about Adam. Adam was given a commandment, a condition, a requirement. These are elements of law, meaning there's some requirement you must meet, there's some condition you must meet, or you will be in sin. Sin is to mean to miss the mark, which is to violate the law, commandment. That belongs to the explicate order. Although today, if you have a child that becomes a teenager and they go out and drive too fast and they get the traffic ticket, who talks to their kid about you sinned, Mary? You sinned, Richard. No, we know they broke the law. We know they violated the law, but we don't raise our children with sin language. And that's because sin is specific to the attempt to establish God identity through doing. And we will go back to Adam to show that this is exactly what Christianity has attempted to do for 2,000 years. Now, what happens in bondage? Well, there's deliverance. That deliverance is a process. It begins in first person with God in Christ raising Jesus, the individual, from the dead, and continues on with the collective body and their striving unto the resurrection of the dead. And the resurrection of the dead is the resurrection of all that were in the first world, because that world completely disappears, vanishes away. And all that's left is the new world, the new creation, the new heaven and earth. Excuse me while I get a drink. We're in the middle of a hot day in Atlanta in April when this is being recorded, and there's pollen everywhere. I would say it's hotter than hell, but we don't believe in that anymore. So I'm just going to keep on going. I will say it's hot enough to fry an egg on the sidewalk. That's a good one. Okay, what does deliverance bring? It brings freedom. And where's freedom found? Freedom is found in the new heaven and earth. Because why? Because identity is innate. And when you move to the implicate order, you have transcended doing. And because you've transcended doing, there is no law. There is simply the innate I am that I am. There's no law for that. So Paul makes a couple of points. To the Galatians, he says, if you want to be under the law, do you not hear what the law is saying? He was concerned that his followers in Galatia were going to be influenced by those who came from Judea and who were trying to force them to be circumcised, because the early followers of Jesus in Judea continued to practice circumcision. Why? Because this deliverance was a process, a step-by-step process. And in the beginning, the Judean followers had an issue with circumcision because it was tied to God identity. I mean, for centuries, that was how you knew God identity. But Paul was realizing that belonged to the explicate order, or the explicate cosmos, and that it was a requirement. When he talked about law, he would say the requirements of the law. So Paul says, look, there's two covenants. That's it. There's two orders in the universe, in biblical cosmology and in the universe, an explicate and an implicate. And guess what? Those two covenants, one comes from Mount Sinai, and what does it give birth to? Bondage. Okay, there's our first element at the top of our, in bold, bondage. Sinai gives birth to bondage. Law Paul says, is that which gives birth to bondage. Why? Because it's impossible for anyone to have God identity by claiming they have met some condition or requirement. Because conditions and requirements can only come from law. Now, what's the other mountain? Well, we'll get to it in just a minute because there's another cosmos, if you will, and that cosmos has a mountain and a symbol for it as well. First, let me, before I leave Galatians, also note what Paul says. If there had been a law given which could have given life, truly righteousness would have been by the law. If there was a requirement of what you needed to do to accept Christ so that you could be righteous, truly, then requirements would have and conditions about accepting Jesus would give you righteousness. Because the people that claim that they are saved purely by the grace of God don't believe that and don't teach that. What they teach is that you will be forgiven by the grace of God only if you have met the requirements of the law. What are the requirements of the law? You must do in some way a conversion into Christ. You must put on Christ through some condition or requirement. And this is, of course, why Paul had to write to the Romans, who thought that all the things they believed and all the things they were doing were the basis of their salvation, and that Israel, who did not believe, was beyond the reconciliatory power of God, the restoration power of God, and that Israel, on the basis of doing, would not be saved. And of course, this is where Paul explains that the process of salvation is tied to the movement of cosmology. And that movement is one entire world vanishes away and another entire world replaces it. There are only two worlds. There are only two orders. There's only two mountains and two covenants, and we can go right down the list. That's it. The removal of one brings about the arrival of the other. And Paul says that the scripture has imprisoned. That's bondage. That's another bondage word. So you can see these threads are everywhere. Once you see the cosmology, these words will jump off the page. So in Romans 8, Paul says the earnest expectation of the creation. Here, Paul is using cosmos language. What is that current creation experiencing? Well, first, Paul says they're waiting for the revealing of the sons of God. Sons of God, that's an identity. Okay? How do you get the identity of Son of God? In the same way Jesus, the individual, got the identity Son of God. He became the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead. Hebrews chapter 1 goes into that in quite some detail. This first cosmos, Paul says, was made subject to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. What was the hope? Well, the creation itself will be delivered from bondage. So the first creation is in bondage. It will be delivered. There's deliverance. That's the process of God. How is deliverance enacted? It is enacted through God's reconciliation power, his restoration power that delivers that creation from bondage of corruption into the glorious freedom of the children of God. God is the story from end to end, meaning in the beginning God, and then in the finality of the story, it is God that is revealed to be all in all. What is the role and function of Christology? The role and function of Christology is to point to that. It is the finger pointing. Its role and function is transform. It is not a new form. The form of the previous explicate cosmos was vanishing away. And we'll see that in a minute. How does this happen? Well, the deliverer will come out of Zion. That's why I mentioned Galatians 4 up here a minute ago. You only have two mountains. One is cosmos number one, that is Sinai. It's law. What does law bring? Bondage. Where does the deliverer come from? The deliverer comes from the implicate order, or the new heaven and earth. And that is known as Zion versus Sinai. And the deliverer, obviously, the role and function of a deliverer is to bring deliverance. So here the process, again, the Christological movement versus the universe's Holomovement is telling the story of the deliverance of humanity from doing in order to have God identity, in order to measure up, in order to pass God's judgment. And the concept of Judgment Day, we've talked about many times. First of all, we don't use our scissors and cut out pieces of the Bible, as many of the postmodern theologians do. We don't ignore parts of the Bible, as a lot of postmodern theologians do. And I'm going to talk about postmodern theology here in the not too distant future. We keep the entirety of the narrative. We don't try to mold it to a thing that we've already come up with and then decide which pieces of the narrative fit what we are saying. We are looking at the narrative as a whole. Judgment Day is a legitimate concept. There was a great Judgment Day. We've talked about that in the past. And what came under judgment at the removal of the Sinai mountain, at the removal of the first covenant, what came under judgment was that cosmos as a system that created bondage, that subjected the creation to bondage. It subjected the creation to futility. What futility? The futility of doing. So, back to Romans 11:26. He says, he will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. That goes all the way back. Jacob, of course, was the father of Israel. He was the father of the 12 sons that became the 12 tribes. God will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. That's all Israel, according to Paul. That's why he says all Israel will be saved. It's Jacob. He doesn't say God will turn away ungodliness from a few of them in Jacob. It's just from Jacob. It's like when Paul says God will reconcile the world. He doesn't say, well, God's going to reconcile a small part of the world. Nor when it talks about the coming restoration of all things, nor does it say, well, technically it's going to be the restoration of a few. Most of the world, unfortunately, will not be restored. Why? Because of their doing, because of the conditions or the requirements they have not met. That's Christian logic. So what does Paul say? This is my covenant with them. This covenant, when I, God as source, when I take away their sins, not when God sits back and says, what did you do? But simply a covenant which is whose source is God. When he could swear by no other, says the book of Hebrews, he swore the oath of this covenant by and to himself. Because, as we'll see later, he couldn't do it with people. Because when you, under the first covenant, attempted to achieve an escape from sin, all people were found to be wanting and under disobedience. So here's our threads. I'm going through a lot of this, and I know that this is a lot of text. I know this is a lot of me throwing out just all this information related to book, chapter, verse, which sounds like something you would be expecting from a fundamentalist preacher. who's trying to get you to convert to Jesus. What I'm saying is, we cannot use the biblical narrative, in my opinion, to prove what we want to prove, only to turn around and leave out all these things on the other hand and still claim about the wonderful message of Jesus and the wonderful message of God as we want to tell it. It has to have all the elements in it. But the problem is, when you're a Christian, you can't do what I'm doing. You can't do it because at the end of the day, as we will see, when Christology is not an identity, you can't be a Christian. You are a child of God. You are one of the children of God. You are known as children of Source because Source is the identity and God is that source. Okay. 1 Corinthians 15. Jesus has to reign until he's put all enemies under his feet. While it is true that Jesus was the firstborn one from the dead, and it is true that the cross was the foundational element of the movement, the Christological movement from death to life, there was a second person collective part of that movement, and that was called body. And that body was formed over a period of time between the cross and the final removal of all form, as symbolized by the form of Jerusalem, a geographical city, a temple, a building in whom God is said to dwell, an identity of male genealogy, an outward form of circumcision, and on we can go with this, until those forms were removed some 40 years after the cross. This is the reign of Christ. He's reigning until all enemies are under his feet, and those enemies relate to sin and death. In fact, Paul says the last enemy that will be destroyed is death. And he goes on to say, because he, God, has put all things under his, Jesus's feet. But when he says all things are put under him, under Jesus, it is evident that he, God, who put all things under Jesus, him, is accepted. God is accepted. Because why? When all things are made subject to Jesus, to him, the Son himself will also be subject to God, who put all things under Jesus, under him. Why? That God may be all in all. The implicate order, that which represents God, not a person, not a man, etc., but rather a source that transcends our human language. It is the all in all implicate order. It is the source from which all things come. And then when that happens, why is even Christ or Christology subject to God? Because Christology is role and function, God is identity. When Christology is role and function, with regard to identity, it is subject to identity because its role and function is to deliver the creation or humanity into that which is identity. And identity is superior to role and function. Let me say a few things about Hebrews, the cosmology of Hebrews. In Hebrews 8, he makes the point, if the first covenant had been faultless, wait a minute, there's a problem with the first covenant? God gave it. Well, if the first covenant had been faultless, had not been faultless, no place would have been sought for a second. Where's the fault lies? What I'm getting to. Finding fault with the people, he says, I make a new covenant. People are the problem when people stand up and try to say who's saved and who's lost, who's accepted and who's not accepted. People are at fault when they try to tell you who God can reconcile and who God cannot reconcile. People are at fault when they tell you what God can restore and what God can't restore, because people are setting themselves up in the place of God as your judge. That's the very thing that's created by requirements and conditions, because each denomination will sit there and tell you what the requirements and conditions are, and they'll disagree with the denominational church across the street, because human beings cannot agree, and human beings are always people who have fault. And so this is why there had to be a second covenant that didn't depend on human doing. Later on, he says, I will be merciful. There's mercy. That's the act of God, mercy. That's the delivering act of God, mercy. That is the Christological movement that corresponds to the Holomovement of our universe. I will be merciful to what? To their unrighteousness. Not merciful to their attempts to be righteous. I will be merciful to their unrighteousness and their sins and their lawless deeds. I will remember no more. It will not be based on lawlessness. It will, God identity will transcend that. And compare that with Romans 11, when Paul notes God has committed all to disobedience, that he might have mercy on all. There's mercy. And mercy follows disobedience. There's only two things, two mountains, two cosmos, two worlds, two ages, this age and the age to come, words of Jesus. We can go on and on, the heavens and the earth, the new heavens and earth. This Jerusalem that's geographical and a coming new Jerusalem. These are the explicate and implicate orders of biblical cosmology. And Hebrews 8:13 says, a new covenant, he's made the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete, this is that 40-year period. After the cross, the covenant had not yet become obsolete, but what was happening to it? As the progression of deliverance was moving forward, as the Christological movement was moving forward, as the reign of Jesus was moving forward to defeat sin by the action of God removing that covenant, that first covenant was growing old at the time this was written, and it was ready or about to vanish away. And when it vanished away, the new creation came, the new heavens and earth came. When the first Jerusalem fell, it was at that time that the new Jerusalem came. Why? Because there's only two orders. That's it. That's the way our universe works. That's the way biblical cosmology works. Do you feel like if you got too close to your computer screen, you were getting powder burn? I was really letting it roll today because, I mean, I've got a lot more material I want to cover. You can always go back and look at this. For those of you that are real students of the narrative and who draw so many lessons as I do from the biblical narrative, I'm really trying to cover a lot of material. So I'm sorry if I was spewing more today than normal, but again, I was really trying to cover a lot of material. So at the next episode, we will continue on and finish up this idea of law and grace. After that, I want to talk about sin. Not because I'm going to do something R-rated. I'm going to talk about sin from this standpoint. I'm going to propose that people confuse the symptom and the cause. That a lot of people are calling the symptoms the whole picture of what sin is. And I'm going to propose that we must go behind the symptoms like discrimination, oppression, injustice. Those are symptoms, but what's the cause? So I'm going to talk about in the final episode that relates to law and grace in the context of Holomovement, Christological movement. I'm going to get into in the final episode what's the cause of sin, because sin entered the world through Adam, and we're going to have to go back to Adam and ask, what was sin? The sin of Adam. It was a sin. Paul is going to verify everything I'm saying, and I'm going to go to Paul because he's the one that's going to interpret Adam, not me. But I'm going to show what it is that Paul is saying, and we're going to get to the root of the problem. So that's where we are for today, and I look forward to seeing you the next time. Thanks for joining me.